It was 75 years ago this past summer that the world saw the first and thankfully only use of nuclear weapons in human history. Despite knowing nothing about the nuclear program when he was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, it was President Harry Truman who made the decision to strike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, with nuclear weapons, thereby bringing World War II to an end. How did America develop the bomb in the first place? Well, Canada's finest science fiction writer has speculated on that in his latest novel called The Oppenheimer Alternative. And it brings Robert J. Sawyer back to the agenda tonight from glorious downtown Mississauga. Great to see you again, Robert. How are you?
Steve, it's great to see you as well. I'm doing fine despite all the madness in the world today. I'm doing all right.
I'm really glad to hear that. Before we get to the nuts and bolts of the story, I am intrigued by the fact that you wrote this book despite not having a publishing contract beforehand. How come?
Absolutely. There were a couple of reasons, but the biggest was I got tired of having deadlines. I had been a book a year writer for most of my career. I'm 30 years a novelist now. There are 24 books out now. And very sadly, a few years ago with my penultimate book, my younger brother got diagnosed with and ultimately died from lung cancer. And I asked to be released from my contractual deadline. And the publisher said, just deliver whenever you're ready. And I realized that without in any way rushing the book, I was able to produce what I thought at the time was my best book ever, Quantum Night, my penultimate book. And now I decided I don't even, financially, I don't need the advance up front. And so I will finish the manuscript and present it to a variety of publishers and find what ideal deal I can find for the book.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm glad to have that story out of the way off the top here. Let's tell the story that you do tell now. Who is the Oppenheimer in the Oppenheimer Alternative?
J. Robert Oppenheimer, he contended the J stood for nothing, was in fact an astrophysicist prior to the war, but he's the man who was tapped by General Leslie R. Groves, the actual leader of the Manhattan Project, which was the international Canada, United States, and Great Britain effort to create the world's first atomic weapons. He tapped Oppenheimer to be the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, largely because, unlike just about every other scientist that Groves interviewed for the job, Oppie would provide direct answers, including the one that most people are loath to say, which is, I just don't know. Nobody knows. It's too new a science. Anybody who is telling you an answer to that question is just making it up. They literally don't know. I'll tell you when I know, and I'll tell you when I don't. And that was good enough for Groves.
Now, is there a particular connection we should know here between J. Robert Oppenheimer and Robert J. Sawyer? That just seems too coincidental to be, I don't know, you tell me.
And the thing is, of course, he went by his middle name, Robert. So I was in the position of writing a novel about a man whose name I couldn't change because he was a historical figure, who used my own first name as if it were his first name. And so I would say, Robert did this, Robert did that. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance, I have to tell you, Steve.
Now, the project, of course, became known as the Manhattan Project, but it was in New Mexico. So why did they call it the Manhattan Project?
So every project under the Department of Defense was assigned to an engineering office. And it happened that the paperwork was at the Manhattan Engineer District in Manhattan, New York City. And simply because of where the paperwork work originated, and of course, the last thing you want is for, and there certainly were, German spies and Russian spies infiltrating the work. The last thing you wanted was to call it the New Mexico Project and give away where the hiding place was. So this bit of administrative banalia that it happened to be Manhattan where the paperwork was filed was good enough for a code name.
Now, of course, America got the bomb first. However, in 1939, you tell us, Albert Einstein told President Franklin Roosevelt at the time, this is before the war started, you really need to start developing a nuclear/atomic bomb. How did FDR take that advice?
So FDR was not immediately seized by it, and many things pass a president's desk, and he had to be reminded several times to look at it. Ultimately, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had also served as Secretary of War in World War I, so he served it in both World Wars, said, "Look, you really got to look at this letter. It's Albert Einstein, for God's sakes." And when FDR finally read it, he said, "We got to do this. We have to do it. Unlimited budget, whoever it takes, whatever it takes, get it done." And that's when it was turned over to Groves, who was known as kind of a fixer. His positive reputation at that point, General Groves, was that he had, it wasn't quite complete at that time, but he was the man who had been selected to build the Pentagon. Later, his negative reputation that we don't talk about much anymore was as one of the chief army engineers. He also built all of the internment camps for Japanese American citizens who were thrown into internment camps simply because of their racial origin during the war.
Well, let me stay with that ethnic angle if I can for a second, because, well, you point this out in the book. It can't be a mere coincidence that many of the scientists who were involved in the project to develop the first atomic bomb had Jewish backgrounds. And of course,
Absolutely.
their confreres in Europe were being destroyed in the Holocaust by Germany. And I wonder how much you think that motivated them to get to the finish line and presumably ultimately hope to use that bomb on Germany.
Well, this is exactly it. The goal originally had never been Japan. The goal had been to put an end to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. And so the target city was, of course, going to be Berlin. And the problem is that the Manhattan Project utterly and completely failed in its mandate, which was to build an atomic bomb in time to defeat Germany, because Germany was ultimately defeated by essentially Russian troops, not American or British troops, but Russian troops pushing in on Berlin to the point at which Hitler said, "I'm better off dead than facing a war crimes trial." And so Hitler, with one bullet from his Luger, did what $2 billion of American, mostly science and technology, had failed to do, which is come up with a weapon that could stop Adolf Hitler. And at that juncture, Steve, many of the scientists, particularly, as you say, the ones of Jewish descent, many of them said, "Well, what are we doing this for now? It's over. I mean, thank God." And it turns out we sent missions in immediately to determine whether Germany was even close to having an atomic bomb of their own, and they were not. So, okay, we're done. And no, Leslie Groves, the military said, everybody continue until we actually defeat Japan. And not with one bomb, but with two. We've got two competing designs. Thin Man, very straightforward physics, and Fat Man, revolutionary physics using the manufactured element of plutonium. I want to test them both. I want to test them on civilian targets. The project continues until that is done.
Okay, Robert, you have used historical documents. You are talking about real life events, obviously, but this is a novel. And I guess what I need to get a better understanding of, and let's go through a few examples fairly briskly here. I need to know what's real and what's Robert J. Sawyer's mind working overtime here. For example,
Yes.
You've got Oppenheimer marrying someone and becoming her fourth husband. Is that true?
Absolutely true.
Wow.
He married Kitty, who became Kitty Oppenheimer. And yes, Kitty had gone through husband after husband after husband. 2 divorces prior to Oppie, and one husband, Joe Dalt, who had died in the Spanish Civil War.
Did she really entrap Robert Oppenheimer into marrying her by getting pregnant?
You know, this is the difficulty of writing this novel in our enlightened time of the 21st century. The Kitty, she was cat-like in that. Yes, she absolutely did, and bragged to her friends. She said, quite literally, I quoted in the novel, and it is from the historical record, "I got him," meaning Oppie, J. Robert Oppenheimer, "I got him to marry me the old-fashioned way. I got pregnant."
Now, did he really sneak off the most secure research facilities base in America so he could have a tryst with a former lover?
Yes. Oppie was one of these geniuses, and he was without any question a genius, who thought he was so clever that he could get away with anything. And if you talk about Greek tragedy, they talk about the hamartia, the fatal flaw. That was his fatal flaw. He thought he could get away with anything. And his mistress and former lover, Jean Tatlock, had sent word to Los Alamos that she was in emotional distress, and Oppie contrived an excuse. She lived in San Francisco. Ernest Lawrence, who was instrumental in the creation of the atomic bomb, was still working at the University of California, Berkeley, just across the bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. And so he contrived an excuse to go see Lawrence, really so he could duck out and spend a night with Jean Tatlock. And this was a big part of his ultimate downfall, was the hubris, the incredible hubris of thinking he could possibly be unnoticed when he did that.
Yeah, Robert, that's just absolutely crazy. I mean, what if he'd been kidnapped? What if something had happened to him? I mean, the whole course of the outcome of the war could have changed. Did he not appreciate that?
This is exactly it. General Groves was absolutely convinced that Oppie and the other senior scientists, Edward Teller, we know these names from history, Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, that they were all likely kidnap targets who would either be enticed with incredibly rich appointments on the Axis side or simply tortured to give up their secrets to the Axis side. Either way. And there was a no-fly edict, which Oppenheimer defied for his trip home, actually, largely because not only were they concerned about kidnapping, but they were also concerned about simply back then flying was not the safest mode of travel. We're talking the 1940s. And you could die in a plane crash, and he could not be risked. So Oppenheimer, this was his downfall, was that he would not see the big picture the way it was required of him to see it by the military.
Well, of course, he was very successful in leading his team to the creation of the first atomic bomb. And after the first successful test, I'm going to read two statements here, and I want to get your sense of which one you think is more accurate. The test is done. Good. Look at us. Look at what we have achieved. Or, oh my God, we now have the capability of destroying the entire world. Which gets closer to the truth?
So for Oppenheimer, at the moment of the first test, I actually think he was very delighted. He showed up at a meeting at Los Alamos doing the standard victory strut across the stage, hands raised. He did it again when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It was only when 3 days later, this word didn't exist in our vocabulary back then, overkill. We use it all the time now. Well, that's overkill. But Oppie was, in fact, one of the very first to ever employ it. And he said the bombing of Nagasaki, just 72 hours before Tokyo, the government in Tokyo had a chance to even assess what had happened, that was overkill. It was unnecessary. And he transitioned at that point and maintained for the rest of his life an enormous melancholic regret over what he had wrought. He felt we had gone quite literally a step too far in bombing Japan twice in such rapid succession.
All right, let me get you to rewind the clock just a few months, because I want to take you to the end of, well, I guess VE Day. We're talking May 1945, victory over Germany. And suddenly a lot of German scientists who've been working on their own weapons programs, well, America's got to make a decision about them. A lot of them came to America, scientists like Wernher von Braun, who invented the V-2 rockets. And here's a quote from your book about that. They'd agreed that when the time came, they would surrender as a unit rather than let the Allies pick whom to employ and whom to execute. They'd also agreed that they couldn't stand the French, who could, that the Soviets were animals, and that the British wouldn't be able to afford anything as grandiose as a peacetime British experimental rocket group. That left the Americans. Most of the Rocketeers had never met a Yankee, and what knowledge they had of their country came from movies, but the Germans knew a real devil here. One they didn't know surely could be no worse. Robert, did the Americans not feel the slightest bit queasy about welcoming all of these former Nazis into their fold?
So the Americans had been given, the American soldiers who were stationed in Germany had been given a list of Nazis that were not wanted for war crimes, but wanted because of their scientific knowledge. And as soon as the group that It was actually Werner von Braun's brother Magnus who had surrendered on behalf of the group because Werner
Hmm.
himself actually had his arm in a cast and couldn't ride a bicycle down the mountain from where they were hiding, where his brother could. Walked into town, looked for a German soldier, and said, "My name's Magnus von Braun. You don't know me. My brother, Werner von Braun, invented the V2. You'll want to talk to him." And that they already had orders from the Allied powers, and particularly from Washington. You betcha we want to talk to him. We want him to come work for us rather than for Stalin and the
The
Russians
Soviets,
in
yes.
whatever post-war world was going to emerge.
Hmm. Now, going forward a few months, did Oppenheimer and any of his team, were they consulted by the White House on whether or how to drop the bombs on Japan?
Yes. And Oppenheimer had participated in that process. The initial targets, Leslie Groves drew up the first list, the military head of the Manhattan Project, presented it to his superior, his ultimate superior, the Minister of War, Henry Stimson, and Stimson scratched off Kyoto. He had been to Kyoto previously. He loved Kyoto, and he knew it was of great spiritual significance to the Japanese. He said, no Kyoto. And this very much frustrated Groves, who felt it was an ideal target. But yes, Oppie himself had served on the target committee, which had gone through, right at the outset of the war, the United States had said, we will not firebomb a half dozen or so Japanese cities. Everything else is fair game, including the capital, Tokyo, which was severely firebombed. We're going to leave a half dozen pristine, untouched, so that we can test in combat the actual effects of an atomic weapon. You drop an atomic bomb on a city that's already been firebombed halfway to extinction, you don't get the data about how effective the atomic bomb was. And so, yes, Oppenheimer was instrumental in the decision and ultimately did not speak up when conscience might have dictated that he should have, and said, you know, we should eliminate the civilian targets, such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and only leave places like Kokura, which was an armory, as potential targets.
And they clearly disregarded his advice. You've got him quoted in the book as saying he felt like he had blood on his hands. Is that an
He
actual quote?
absolutely said that, 100% true quote, to which, I don't know if you can say this on TV Ontario,
Go for it.
President Truman said after he left the office, I never want to see that son of a bitch in this office again, referring to Oppenheimer, because Truman very much, he was the first nuclear president, remember.
Mm.
And the protocol we have today was not in place. The protocol today is only, God help us, Donald Trump can order the use of nuclear weapons by the United States right now, only the commander in chief. Back in the day, it was the opposite. Only the commander in chief had final veto authority to stop what the military had planned to do. So Truman could have said, no, 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 don't do it. But it was going to go ahead without him actually saying, yes, you have permission. But ultimately, nonetheless, Truman took on the mantle and said, if anybody's got blood on his hands, he was the one, remember, who had that sign on his desk, the Missourian, who had that sign that says the buck stops here. And whatever failings he might have had as a president, he took that very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
He said, it was my decision. Oppenheimer, you're just a cog in the machine. I don't care what your feelings are in this matter.
Well, having said that, you mentioned Edward Teller earlier in our conversation, and you've got him quoted in the book as saying, I have no hope of clearing my conscience. The things we are working on are so terrible that no amount of protesting or fiddling with politics will save our souls. How representative was that quote of the group of scientists who worked on the bomb?
So it's an absolutely true quote from Teller. It's not particularly representative of Teller. He became Ronald Reagan's chief proponent of Star Wars, the missile-based strategic, space-based anti-ballistic missile strategic defense initiative. And to his dying day, he went on to become the father of the hydrogen bomb, the much more powerful, by which I mean 2-3 orders of magnitude more powerful than atomic bombs that we live in fear of today, the H-bomb. He was the father of that. He very quickly got over his pangs of conscience. But for almost every other person involved, indeed with the exception of Teller And the military had Groves, who maintained both to their dying days that they had done the right thing. Every other scientist came either immediately or over the passing of time to regret very much what they had wrought because they came to realize it had never been necessary.
Robert, I want to spend our last couple of minutes just asking you a couple of personal questions, and that is, given your interest in science and you having now written this book, how much do you wish you had been there in New Mexico, in the desert, back in the day, to watch these guys do their thing?
You know, there had never been a congress, a gathering together of such scientific geniuses before or since. In that narrow sense, to see them all together in one place, to see the greatest scientific minds of the post-quantum mechanics revolution. So you set aside Isaac Newton, who lived in a simpler time. But in our modern paradigm of physics, to get to meet, shake hands with, this was pre-COVID-19, say hello to, it would have been a wonderful experience. But my God, I would have liked to have taken each and every one of them by the lapels they surely had back in those days when scientists dressed like businessmen and said, you don't need to do this. Japan is suing for peace already. They're making back channel overtures. All they want is a guarantee that Hirohito, their divine emperor, will continue to sit on the throne, which he did for another 48 years after the war. All they want is that one concession, and they will stand down. You never have to use this monstrosity on human beings.
Now, Oppenheimer, of course, he died fairly young. He was only 62 years old. He died in 1967. Yes. However, his son Peter, who was 4 years old, I guess, when his father died, he's still alive. He's a man in his late 50s, and I want to know if you've ever met him or talked to him.
So Peter was 4 years old when the Trinity test happened.
Oh, I see.
When his father died, he was a grown man.
He was a grown man, yes.
By that point. Peter is still alive, and I deliberately did not seek him out. And this is the novelist's prerogative. Robert Oppenheimer has no right of reputation at this point. No dead person does. Anybody can say whatever they want about the dead, good taste notwithstanding. I feel I'd fairly treated Oppenheimer, but suppose I had said to Peter, now, Peter, I'm thinking about writing a book about your dad. And he said, oh, God, Rob, please don't bring up his infidelity to my mom one more time. You know, I know he went off and saw Jean Tatlock. I know he brought, but do we have to dredge that up? Well, yeah, we kind of do. So Peter is the only still living character in my novel. I hope he will read it and judge it a fair portrayal of his mother and his father and his sister, who was committed suicide subsequently, who's also in the novel. But I felt if I'd asked permission as a polite Canadian, I'd be constrained by whatever response he gave, and that would have limited my artistic creativity.
I totally get it. You've done another fantastic job, I have to say. I love reading your work. The Oppenheimer Alternative is worth people's attention, and I hope you sell 1 million copies. Robert J. Sawyer, thanks so much for being on TVO tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.